Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar. Thank you for attending. I am Reverend Bob Moore. I'm Executive Director of the Coalition for Peace Action, headquartered in Princeton, and the head of our Pennsylvania office at Aguilar. I want to give a special shout out to him as we start this. He just waved. Ed is in Philadelphia and heads up that office, and he's been instrumental in putting today's program together. So we're all very grateful for that. I want to also mention our co-sponsors for today's event, the Physicians for Social Responsibility of Pennsylvania, Peace Day Philly, and the United Nations Association of Greater Philadelphia, and also of Princeton and Trenton. We're very appreciative of those co-sponsors. I want to say just a word before I introduce our first speaker. I want to say just a word about how today's program is going to run. We are going to have a total of 4 speakers, 2 of whom I consider to be keynoters. And they will go first. Ambassador Tom Graham and Erin Hunt will each speak for about 20 minutes. And I'll introduce Ambassador Graham, and Ed's going to be introducing Erin. Then Mary Day Kent of the United Nations Association of Greater Philadelphia will make some remarks, and I'll make some remarks. After the 4 of us have gone, and while the program's going, any speaker you have that you have a question of, there's going to be a place in the chat box for you to submit your question in writing. So you don't have to try to remember it until the end of all 4 speakers. That would be quite a bit to ask. So please feel free. When you put it in the chat box, it's not going to be seen by everybody else here. For various reasons, security reasons and otherwise, we're having that go to just the hosts of today's meeting. And then Ed will be the one going through those and presenting those questions at the end. So again, thank you for joining us. I think we have a really good program in store. We'll try to be very disciplined and run this in the way that I just mentioned. Our first speaker is going to be Ambassador Tom Graham Jr. He served for nearly 3 decades at the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, including a decade and a half as General Counsel and also the acting director of the agency for most of 1993. That year, he led the effort to establish a long-term moratorium on the conduct of nuclear weapons tests. By the way, that's a moratorium still in effect. From 1994 to 1996, he was a principal figure in the worldwide effort to successfully support the conclusion of the comprehensive test ban negotiations. In 1994, President Clinton appointed him as Special Representative for Arms Control, Nonproliferation, and Disarmament with the rank of Ambassador. From 1993 to 1995, Ambassador Graham led the successful U.S. government effort to indefinitely extend the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So with that brief introduction, let us welcome Ambassador Tom Graham.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Ed, and to the Coalition for inviting me to speak at this really interesting webinar. I wish we had more time for questions, because I'm sure we could have a great discussion among ourselves and with the audience, but time is what it is. I'm going to speak on non-first use, and that is force to use nuclear weapons first. Briefly, we'll give us here a status of where that option sits in various countries. The US has reserved the right to use nuclear weapons first, not just against nuclear weapons, but against chemical, biological, cyber, and conventional weapons as well. The UK has done the same, and NATO has very much done the same. France probably has done the same, but they say there's certain legal complications which makes them not so strident on first use, but have never really, at least to me, explained what those are. Russia once had a no first use policy, the Soviet Union did, but gave it up long ago. So they're a first use country. And China has had a no first use policy since their first test explosion in the days of Mao. Of course, some argue that it's not, they don't really mean it, but then you can argue that about almost anything. They've certainly kept it, and they consider it as Mao's policy, the present day Chinese, and anything that can be identified as Mao's policy is sacrosanct in the Chinese government. Well, briefly back to the beginning, during World War II, the US developed nuclear weapons because Einstein and others correctly convinced Franklin Delano Roosevelt that with the physics capability that Germany had, they might get them first and win the war. That was the reason the Manhattan Project was started. After the war, the US didn't do much in terms of building nuclear weapons, maybe 4 or 5, until the Soviets had their first nuclear explosion with technology largely stolen from Los Alamos. And that touched off a chain reaction in the United States. And we began building nuclear weapons at, quote, an industrial rhythm, close quote, as the French described it. By the 1960s, the United States had constructed more than 70,000 nuclear weapons, with around 31,200 in the stockpile at any one time. And then I might throw in here, that's far inconceivably more weapons than any rational crazy person who wanted to fight a nuclear war could possibly use. The Soviet high numbers were, high points were 55,000 total, and about 40,200 that they kept in their stockpile for many years. The two countries claimed that they were second strike countries. They would not use nuclear weapons first, either under a nuclear attack. They would respond with devastating force after the enemy's nuclear weapons had landed and exploded on their territory. That, of course, was a lie. It was not true. Both sides had launch on warning policies, which they preferred not to discuss with the public. And that is that as soon as your early warning systems, as soon as they saw with their radar the first missiles come over the pole, then and they were so identified, then you would launch yours, your complete force. And so that was the real policy, and the U.S. expected to see expected the Soviet missiles to strike its territory in about 20 minutes after first sight. So we had a practice of responding to that and practiced it and carried out exercises on this practice many times during the Cold War. And the way it worked was that the first 10 minutes after citing, would involve a discussion among the senior aides of the president, Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Commander of the Strategic Air Command, National Security Advisor, and so forth. And if they decided that this was real, that they would then awaken the president or contact the president. And whether he was asleep, whether he was asleep in his bed or whether he was fishing in Idaho, and he would be told that, Mr. President, here's what we see, here's what's coming, and we all agree that it's real. You have 6 minutes to give your decision as to what we should do. And Ronald Reagan commented on that in his diary and perhaps elsewhere. And this is a quote from Ronald Reagan himself in his diary. 6 minutes to decide how to respond to a blip on a radar scope and decide whether to unleash Armageddon? How could anyone apply reason at a time like that? That's Ronald Reagan. And he was correct in that this created a serious risk of nuclear war taking place by miscalculation or accident. Indeed, during the Cold War, there were at least 4 well-documented such instances, 2 on each side, and nuclear war was narrowly avoided. Cuban Missile Crisis, the computer failure in 1979, which happened in the middle of the night, and Jimmy Carter came within 2 or 3 minutes of launching. Maybe not that close. Came within 7 or 8 minutes of launching our nuclear force. In the end, they found out that it was a computer failure before they had to awaken Carter. That was Brzezinski's job. On the Soviet side, the Soviets at one point were so worried about a first strike, they established a computer system. They had the KGB do that, which measured the strength of the US and NATO versus the strength of the Soviet Union, counting the US as at 100. And the Soviet Politburo policy was that if that balance, according to their computer system, if that ever fell below 40, then it was Politburo policy to seriously consider a preemptive strike with all their forces on the United States, in the view that that's the only way they could survive, because they were convinced the US was planning to do the same to them with much greater forces. And right in the middle of that, a Soviet early warning station received a message from some new satellites that had just been put in place. And it was around midnight one night in the middle of this, it was in 1983. And first it showed 1 Minuteman launch from the Midwest, and then 5 more. And the chief officer of that station was under orders to report whatever he saw, whatever his unit saw on their systems, and report that up to the Office of the General Staff. But he didn't trust those satellites, and he couldn't see any other systems, other technology giving that warning. So he called the Office of the General Staff and talked to his counterpart, and he said, false alarm. And just as he said that, 5 more missile launches were reported by the satellites. And he had to decide right there. He couldn't run any checks. And he said, false alarm. Got it, said the officer that worked for the chief of the general staff. It turned out, of course, that he was right. The satellites had read sunlight on the wings of an airplane as a launch. But if he had obeyed his orders and just reported what they saw, there would have been an all-out nuclear war between the US and the United States for sure, because of the then current attitude of preemptive strike that existed in the Politburo. So at that time, we had the right man in the right place at the right time. But you can't always count on that. And we're going to have future crises, and nuclear weapons are going to be with us for a long time, unfortunately, and therefore nuclear weapon crises could be with us for a long time. And we just must make the world safer. Right, as I said, the right man or woman may not be there when at the right time in the right place. So one way we can help this, one way we can make the world safer is to get a pledge from the United States that it will never be the first to use nuclear weapons. It will never, against any weapon, but they'll never use such weapons at all, except against other nuclear weapons. And so that the deterrence policy becomes no first use of nuclear weapons in response to other nuclear weapons, no other use at all. And that is particularly if that can be extended to the other members of the nuclear hierarchy that have nuclear weapons, the nuclear countries, the P5 as it were, that would be a real step forward. Now, I didn't go much into the current status. I did mention the P5 use policies, but then there's other countries too. Israel has a very difficult to understand use policy. Their weapons were acquired to prevent Arab conventional forces from overwhelming Israel. And now the Israel army is more powerful than they are. So what are they deterring? And so it's hard to say what their use policy is. They may not know what it is themselves. India, I believe, made a no first use policy, no first use declaration to Pakistan, maybe not to China, but to Pakistan. But Pakistan did not respond. But India joined the moratorium. China's a part of the moratorium, and Pakistan sort of is as well. So that at least helps that there won't be any more tests. But no first use has always been very complicated. It's sort of been the third rail issue in disarmament. It's like abortion in public politics. You just can't touch it because it was seen as the way that we extended the nuclear umbrella, and we and we had to have a policy of first use against any major threat, particularly nuclear weapons. And I've found myself in trouble once when I was in government and once when I was out of government, but with the support of certain people in the government for advocating a no first use policy, which I think is better for everyone, including the United States. So if we could begin with a formal pledge deposited with the United Nations Secretary General of no first use, that the US will never use nuclear weapons first in a nuclear confrontation and won't use them at all against anything else. Even if it's a nuclear weapon state, if they've used chemical weapons against us, we will not respond with nuclear weapons. This would be a big step forward for peace, security, and non-proliferation. And as I said, if we can extend that policy to other countries that possess nuclear weapons, that would be a very good thing. Some of them might, some of the countries beyond the P5 might even go along. India and Pakistan just might. I don't know about Israel or North Korea. They're very hard to read. But if that could happen, possession of nuclear weapons would be seen as only for the purpose of deterring nuclear war. No other reason. They don't represent prestige, which they do now, and they shouldn't be used to deter other types of weapons, chemical, biological, cyber, conventional, and future weapons not yet developed. So, as I said at the beginning, a no first use in the US for the first time ever, may be doable this year, early next. It could result in making nuclear weapon deployments more defensive in nature and not as offensive as they currently are. If it didn't do that, it wouldn't be plausible. If you didn't make your deployments in such a way that they are clearly defensive, then obviously you must not really believe in no first use. So it should have that effect as well. As I mentioned, China has had such a policy since the days of Mao, and hopefully still support that. President Biden indicated during the campaign that he would support a no first use policy. I think he's the first presidential candidate ever to do it. If he does this, he certainly will be the first president in office ever to declare a no first use policy. Obama came close, but not all the way. And President Biden must make a decision in the coming months in the formulation of his nuclear posture review to be submitted to Congress as required by law. While nothing is sure in life, declaring a no first use of nuclear weapons policy would be a long step toward peace and stability.
Ambassador Graham, we're right at the end of your time. Can we wrap up now?
Yes.
All right, thank you so much. And let's show Ambassador Graham.
Can I make one more comment? Oh, okay. I'll stop now.
Ed Aguilar, could you introduce our next speaker
Okay.
now?
Right. Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank Ambassador Graham, who is, I believe, one of the most knowledgeable people in the United States, if not in the world, on these issues. And I've known Tom for 30 years, and he's always been a stalwart for non-proliferation and disarmament. So thank you very much. But next, I am delighted to welcome for us our Canadian neighbor and a longtime peace activist, Erin Hunt of Minds Action Canada, and also Icann, which is, as you may know, the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons. She's been very active on both fronts. So in looking at her bio, I see that Erin gets around worldwide. She has, since 2003, worked on, as I mentioned, the Landmines Treaty, which was passed overwhelmingly at the United Nations. And since then, she's worked on its enforcement, not always an easy task. Since 2006, Erin has worked as well to end cluster munitions, which really are anti-civilian munitions as well. And she's done a great deal of public education on both of those issues as well. Finally, I have to mention that Erin was a key member of the Icann negotiating team focusing on compensation and assistance. This is in negotiating the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. She worked on compensation and assistance to the victims of nuclear weapons, beginning, of course, with the Hibakusha in Japan, but also victims of testing and development. As you know, this is a very large issue in the Pacific, where the US did much of its testing in the Marshall Islands, in Japan, places like Kazakhstan, where the Soviets did much of their testing, and other Pacific islands where France and Great Britain did. So anyway, Erin has written many articles, has been on many international websites on nuclear weapons. In fact, that is where I first encountered her this year and really wanted to have her speak to us. So with that, please give a warm welcome to Erin Hunt. Erin, please go ahead.
Oh, thanks so much, Ed. Thank you all for the really kind invitation to join you today. Since knowing where we are is the first step to any journey, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about how we got to where we are right now, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And I'd also like to say that, like, for me, I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen people on the west coast of Canada. But I recognize that most of you have logged on from the Lenape-Holking, which is the traditional homelands of the Lenape people. Recognizing that we're on Indigenous land is especially important when talking about nuclear weapons. For decades, nuclear weapons, as you heard, were tested on Indigenous land in the United States, Australia, Algeria, and in the Pacific, without the permission or in some cases the knowledge of local people. So acknowledging whose land we are on when we're doing this work is a really important first step towards reconciliation and rectifying this exclusion. I've been asked to tell you what's next for banning nuclear weapons. But first, let's tell you the story of how we got here. And here is where over 50 countries around the world have joined a treaty banning nuclear weapons. This is really the story of how ordinary people used hope and courage to do something impossible, ban the bomb and take humanity a whole step closer to a world without nuclear weapons. At Minds Action Canada, we believe that ordinary people have an extraordinary impact. And as a partner organization of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or Icann, we've really seen that belief brought to life. Everyone I met in my time campaigning with Icann was motivated by hope and by a pretty simple conviction. Due to their unacceptable humanitarian impact, nuclear weapons must be prohibited and then eliminated, and that we all have a role to play in that process. I mean, there is no question that nuclear weapons cause catastrophic humanitarian harm. Regardless of your knowledge of medicine, nuclear physics, arms control, international law, or diplomacy, it's easy to see that an indiscriminate weapon whose impacts cannot be contained poses an unacceptable risk to us, the land, and the creatures we share it with. For too many decades, the global conversation about nuclear weapons was something for the experts. And most of those times, the experts were men with security or military backgrounds. The opinions of the rest of us, ordinary people, were something to be humored. Well, maybe. But nuclear disarmament and nuclear deterrence was serious work for serious people. And it couldn't be like tainted with humanity or emotion. Actually discussing what nuclear weapons would do to people was considered a weakness. Now, that sentiment has started to shift around 2010 through the work of Icann and a group of like-minded states who began to speak about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. The humanitarian initiatives meetings in Oslo, Norway in 2013, and Nayarit, Mexico, and Vienna, Austria in 2014 really opened up the conversation about nuclear weapons. By the end of the meeting, the possibility of negotiating a treaty banning nuclear weapons was looking more and more like an achievable goal. Talking about what nuclear weapons do to people, actually bringing the evidence to the table, was one of the ways Icann and the international community was able to break through diplomatic deadlock. More importantly, talking about the humanitarian impact of these abhorrent weapons allows all of us to have a say. No longer was an in-depth knowledge of warhead yields required to advocate for disarmament. The mere recognition of the global catastrophic humanitarian harm that nuclear weapons could cause is enough to justify any of us speaking up on that issue. Every person and every state has a stake in nuclear disarmament, and we were no longer willing to wait around for the nuclear weapon states to disarm. At the United Nations General Assembly in 2015, states voted to hold what was called an open-ended working group on nuclear disarmament. And the next year, that open-ended working group recommended that the United Nations start negotiating a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. At the end of 2016, majority of the UN General Assembly voted to start those negotiations. And in March 2017, the first meetings of the negotiations started. And by July 7th of that year, 122 states adopted the treaty text. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons entered into force, so it became binding international law for its states parties on January 22nd this year. And there are now 55 states parties, and that number continues to grow. And those state parties are organizing their first annual meetings of states parties to take place in March next year in Vienna, Austria. This is a key milestone in a global effort to eliminate nuclear weapons. Okay, now I'm a little worried that that quick summary may have made things sound easy. But let me assure you, this was not an easy process. These milestones were built on decades of activism by ordinary people who hoped for a safer future. And having hope is really important, but you also have to have the courage to stand up for a better future in the face of opposition. Campaigners face naysayers in almost every country around the world when they started talking about a new treaty banning nuclear weapons. The nuclear armed states and their allies were angry. Diplomats supporting the ban treaty were confronted and pressured not to attend the humanitarian initiatives meetings, to vote against the start of negotiations, and to not attend the negotiations. Ban proponents were accused of undermining the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and of dividing the international community. One particularly memorable example was an informal statement by the United Kingdom that made allusions to the UK and the US causing problems for the NPT if states went ahead with the negotiations, and condescendingly disregarded banned states' security concerns about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons as not real. Long-standing colonial power dynamics were resurrected and used to coerce states. Funding to civil society organizations like Icann were cut, and some former champions of nuclear disarmament like my own country, Canada, went strangely silent. But one of Icann's videos produced in the lead up to the negotiations reminded viewers that it takes courage to change the world. And nuclear disarmament takes courage because nuclear weapons are shrouded in myth. These myths tell us that nuclear weapons keep us safe, that they are essential for world order, that, as you heard from Ambassador Graham, they're prestigious, and that without them, our lives are at risk. These are not facts. We have endowed nuclear weapons with abilities they don't have. All nuclear weapons can do is destroy cities and kill civilians by the thousands. You would never hear that weaponized anthrax keeps us safe or that stockpiles of sarin are essential for world order. But we've created these myths about nuclear weapons. But that's a key word. We created these myths, so of course we can destroy them. But it takes a lot of courage to speak out against such commonly held beliefs. The examples of courage in Icann are breathtaking though. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki joined survivors of nuclear weapons testing to share their personal stories again and again in an effort to convince decision makers that nuclear weapons are unacceptable, must be prohibited, then eliminated. I don't know if I would have the courage to relive the worst day of my life over and over again, but these survivors have found it and more, working for decades to prevent others from suffering as they and their families have. Listening to them and taking their expertise seriously is key to forever eliminating nuclear weapons. Alongside survivors, campaigners worked nationally, regionally, and globally, crossing borders, generations, genders, and every possible way to divide humanity. The Icann delegation at the negotiations included youth, as well as the elderly survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, physicians and lawyers, teachers and students, faith leaders and academics, advocates and Indigenous peoples. In short, pretty much ordinary concerned citizens from around the world. And our diversity was very much our strength. It resulted in an inclusive, comprehensive, and effective treaty that can safely be called feminist. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has some of the strongest language on gender ever in a disarmament treaty. Not only does it recognize that nuclear weapons and the radiation they cause have different impacts on men, women, girls, and boys, but it also promotes the participation of women in the treaty's decision-making processes and implementation. The recognition that nuclear weapons activities have had a disproportionate impact on Indigenous peoples in the treaty's preamble is absolutely groundbreaking. This is the first disarmament treaty to recognize the rights of Indigenous people, and that's all due to the hard work of the Indigenous activists on whose land is still contaminated from nuclear weapons tests more than a half century ago. The impacts of nuclear colonialism continue to be felt, but these treaty provisions open space for marginalized populations who have been excluded by the nuclear deterrence narrative for decades. Courageous people acting collectively brought the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons from hope to reality and ensured it was an inclusive and pragmatic step towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. But what's next? And what Ed really wanted me to talk about was how can you play a role? So getting the treaty negotiated and entered into force was the easy part. Hope and courage are going to be even more important now. The current international priorities for the treaty, now that it's entered into force, are implementing it and universalizing it. Implementing it means taking the words from rhetoric to reality, and that's something that the states that have joined the treaty are going to be concentrating on. While universalizing means bringing more states on board the treaty and strengthening the norms it is creating. And that's where the work is needed here in North America. But we need to know that this means going directly up against some of the most entrenched myths about nuclear weapons, how important they are to our security and how necessary they are for our alliances. None of these myths are true, remember, but still, speaking out against them is not going to be easy. You will need the courage to stand up for your convictions. I believe if you're in an event like this on a Sunday afternoon, you know that you belong on the right side of history. But I'm going to be honest, I don't think we're going to see the United States joining the ban treaty in the next few years. It's going to be a slow process, but I know it will happen in some way or another, eventually. I come from a background of working on landmines and cluster munitions, as you heard in my introduction. The United States is still outside the treaties banning both of these weapons, but it abides by the norms that the treaties have established by not using these weapons, ending production for the most part, and by really strongly supporting victim assistance and landmine and cluster munition clearance in affected communities. Even before signing and ratifying the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the United States can contribute to the treaty's implementation by focusing on the positive obligations provisions in the treaty and making steps towards the norms. These provisions on victim assistance and environmental remediation in the treaty mean that it is already having an impact. It is these provisions that offer Americans the opportunity to engage meaningfully with the treaty and to address the harm caused by American nuclear weapons tests in the United States and in the Pacific. Okay, the importance of nuclear weapons to NATO always is cited as a reason to avoid the ban treaty. But it's important to know the treaty does not require states to leave NATO. What is required is work to reduce the importance of nuclear weapons in NATO doctrine and to allow states to opt out of the nuclear part of the alliance. Remember, the North Atlantic Treaty does not mention nuclear weapons. NATO only declared itself an explicitly nuclear alliance 11 years ago, and different member states have different relationships to nuclear weapons. So it isn't actually an insurmountable problem. A number of NATO states are coming under public pressure to opt out of the American nuclear umbrella, including Germany, Belgium, Spain, and the Netherlands, as well as Iceland, and hopefully Canada. NATO does need to have a serious discussion of its nuclear weapons. Remember, no one will argue that stockpiles of anthrax keep us safe. So why is this important alliance to both of our countries talking about nuclear weapons that way? But for the US to take any of these steps, the government needs to hear from citizens. So you can tell your elected representatives you want to see the United States sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and ask them to sign, as individuals, Icann's parliamentary pledge. To do this, you've got to think about what motivates elected officials. It's their constituent needs. So you need to make your appeals specific and personal. Remember, people usually run for office to make things better. And pointing out that this is an opportunity for them to make the world a little bit safer, start making change, and be on the right side of history with a little effort can be very successful. As constituents, it's your job to give your elected officials the courage they need to put their name on the pledge. Once you have one signatory, ask them to help get their colleagues on board. This has been very successful in Canada. It's called snowballing, which I know is probably a fine name for everyone in Pennsylvania, but if I was talking to people in Florida, I might have to come up with a different term for it. But like rolling a snowball down the hill, once you get the ball rolling, you can pick it up and really expand the snowball, or in this case, the pledge. I'm not an expert on US politics, but I know there's some helpful work in Congress around the no first use policy, which, as you've heard, would be a really important step forward. There's also been discussions about the cost of modernizing the American nuclear arsenal, so you can definitely highlight those issues for your representatives to champion. You can also call on your city to take a stand. Cities are the target of nuclear weapons, and it would be city first responders who would have to attempt to do something if nuclear weapons were ever used again. So you can ask your local government to endorse the Icann Cities Appeal, which over 50 US cities have done, including Philadelphia. Now, you can learn about both the Cities Appeal and the Parliamentary Pledge on the Icann website, which is icanw.org. You can also reach out to decision makers at the state level to sign the pledge, or have the state pass resolutions in support of the TPNW, like California, Oregon, New Jersey, and Maine have. Just because the federal government is slow doesn't mean you can't make progress on other levels of government. Cities and states that have passed resolutions in support of the TPNW can then work on disinvesting from nuclear weapons producers. Municipal and state pension funds should be divesting from nuclear weapons producing companies. And you know what? Often all that's needed for that disinvestment to start is for the citizens and the staff to find out what the pension fund is supporting. This is something you can do either at a higher level or even on your personal level. All you need to do is visit don'tbankonthebomb.com to find out if your bank or financial institution is funding nuclear weapons producers. If they are, tell them you're unhappy with that. You can close accounts and move into institutions who do not invest in nuclear weapons producers. Banks and financial institutions are nothing without your money. So you have the power to make sure they're being responsible and ethical with it. Okay. So when I started, I said I wanted to tell you a story of ordinary people who've had an extraordinary impact. And through Hope and Courage, we've definitely been more successful than we really dared dream. But this story is just getting started, and we really need your help to write the next chapter.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much, Erin. I'm delighted to have heard your discussion, and I think that you have some very practical steps as well, because it's civil society, as you said, that it's going to make the difference for this treaty to go further and to go all the way in the end. So thanks very much. Next, we have two speakers whom I'll introduce together. If I can find it, here we go. First, we have Mary Day Kent, who is a veteran of many struggles for peace and justice. As a member of the Chestnut Hill meeting of the Society of Friends, and in many other ways, she is the former advocacy director on a national level with CARE USA. She was the executive director of WILP, which is the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, one of the oldest and, in my judgment, one of the most effective movements, really, organizations for peace and justice in the world. She has several times, as well, including currently, been the president of an organization I'm proud to be part of, the United Nations Association of Greater Philadelphia. That's our Philadelphia chapter. And by the way, we also have, as Bob mentioned, we have Jeffrey Laurenti, leader in the Princeton/Trenton chapter of the UNAGP. So that is, let me also, I'm sorry, I have to find my note. Bob Moore, of course, many of you know, most of you know, is the longtime leader and executive director of the Coalition for Peace Action. As a matter of fact, we just celebrated his 40th anniversary as executive director of the Coalition for Peace Action. So congratulations, Bob, on that. And as most of you know, CFPA, under Bob's leadership, has worked not only on the abolition of nuclear weapons, but also ending gun violence at home and international arms trafficking, as well as more recently on the climate crisis, which Bob likes to call, unfortunately correctly, the climate catastrophe. So without more, let me just turn it over to Mary Day Kent. Welcome, Mary Day.
Thank you, Ed. I am very happy to be engaged in this event with so many people and recognizing the International Day of Peace, which was declared by the United Nations in 1981. Officially, it's the 21st of September, and there will be some events here in Philadelphia on the 21st, Tuesday. But in actuality, around the world, if you look online, you will see that there are people all over the US and all over the world who are engaged in similar kinds of events, advancing and focusing on peace causes. So I'm very happy to be part of the United Nations Association, which promotes support for the United Nations, which is a form of supporting peace and human rights and the possibility of a global community that works on issues like refugees and climate change, particularly. And I think it's worth noting that the United Nations General Assembly started this week. It opened in New York at the United Nations in New York. And this is the 76th General Assembly. And next week, it will continue with the week of heads of states and high-ranking people coming to represent their country's concerns at the United Nations. There was a letter in the Philadelphia Inquirer a couple of weeks ago, very good letter about peace and refugees and human rights. And it ended up saying, we should have some kind of global organization so that people could work on these things together. And the good news is we have that global organization, and it is the United Nations, and it struggles, it's imperfect, and it certainly needs more support, but it does exist, and it does an amazing amount of work. I think many of us in the United States, even those who are not opposed to the UN, people of my age, which is almost as old as the United Nations, were brought up supporting the UN, but with the idea that supporting the UN was something that we in the US did as a favor to the rest of the world. And that is absolutely not the best way to look at it, because we are citizens in the world and we are helped by the United Nations. We benefit from the United Nations, and we need to support the UN for the sake of all of us, not as a favor to the rest of the world. Specifically, the UN, when it started right at the end of World War II, focused on nuclear disarmament and refugees. The UN High Commission for Refugees officially started its international agreement on refugees in 1950, and they continue to function. After peace and refugees, the UN focused on human rights, on decolonization, on economic and social development, and recently more and more on climate change as a global threat to all of us. At this moment, the UN High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR, which has an organization in the US to support UNHCR's work around the world, they calculate that there are 82.4 million people around the world who are forcibly displaced. That includes 3.5 million people in Afghanistan who are internal displaced people, meaning forcibly required to flee from their homes, but they haven't crossed an international border. Crossing an international border makes you a refugee, and there are an additional 3 million Afghani refugees in countries such as Pakistan and Iran. The numbers of people that we've seen in the last couple of weeks, last month, evacuated from Kabul in the airlift adds up at this point to over 100,000 people. There are 23, almost 24,000 who are here in the United States from that frantic, chaotic airlift of the last few weeks. There are another 100,000 who were in the airlift one way or another, who are in suspense and somewhat in chaos in US military bases around the world, waiting for clearance and processing. The Biden administration, when it came in, horrified many of us by announcing that they were going to continue the Trump administration's cap on refugees from the entire world, limiting to 15,000 for the year. There was a huge negative reaction to that from NGOs, nonprofit groups, and people, churches, and other religious organizations. And the Biden administration went back to saying, we will take for the entire world, for the entire year, 62,000 refugees. In fact, only about 10,000 have been admitted this year, and the US fiscal year ends in October. So there is legally, there's over 40,000 refugee places already authorized that we could use for Afghan refugees. So this is something that could be easily done within bureaucratic and political processes. There is a bill in Congress, which the representative of many of us, Dwight Evans, has supported, which would commit the US to taking up to 200,000 Afghan refugees from this current end of the US conflict in Afghanistan. And that's definitely something that we should support. One of the basic things that the UN Association advocates for always is for full US funding of our commitments to the United Nations. And I think that we need to recognize that the United Nations, for example, the UNHCR budget for this year is $9.15 billion. Now that's a lot of money, but $9.15 billion is about 0.25% of the US national budget. So it's a very small amount, and I hope that we can all act to support this. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Mary Day. That was a very informative talk, and I commend to you the bill from Dwight Evans. And if you have more information on that, Mary Day, you can put it on the chat, or you can follow up with an email and we can send it out. Okay, because that's a very important bill, not only for Afghan refugees, but people from all over the world who are fleeing persecution. So thank you very much for that. And next up we have, again, the Reverend Bob Moore, Executive Director of Coalition for Peace Action. Bob, take it away, please.
Thank you. And I'm going to be sharing with you an op-ed about to prevent more endless wars, demilitarize U.S. foreign policy in the federal budget. This has been accepted by NJ.com, which is associated with the Star Ledger, the largest newspaper in New Jersey. And I have posted it in the chat box if you want to take a look at the written version. I'm going to just quickly read through it, and I think that's the best way to keep myself disciplined to stick to the time limit that we have. As the longest war in U.S. history in Afghanistan recently came to a messy and painful close, it's time to challenge the U.S. policy since the end of World War II of maintaining a large, expensive military during peacetime instead of returning to a much smaller, defense-only military. As I reflect on the numerous debacles of U.S. military and CIA interventions abroad since 1945, from Korea to Cuba to Vietnam to Iran, Chile, and Libya to Lebanon, Afghanistan, and Iraq, I am struck by how wrong-headed and counterproductive they have been. In every case, despite a heavy price in terms of blood and money, they have led to outcomes that were as bad and often worse than before our interventions. I am reminded of the old adage, if your only tool is a hammer, then every problem is going to look like a nail. By relying primarily on the hammer of military intervention to address these problems, we have earned a reputation of being a nation that tries to determine the outcomes of problems around the world by engaging in endless wars that seek to violently control what happens in those other nations. Certainly after 9/11, there needed to be a strong response that would prevent future terrorist attacks. But at the time, the global community was united in its determination to work with the US to take effective action. A much better approach would have been to take full advantage of that solidarity, to take a policing/international law approach that would have sought to locate and capture the attackers, bring them to trial, and punish them accordingly. This would have potentially resulted in far less violence and prevented a 20-year forever war. Such forever wars are also extremely expensive. War or no war, the US military budget has remained at 50 to 60% of the discretionary federal budget. Now that's money Congress can allocate however it chooses. It excludes trust funds like Social Security and Medicare. For 2020, military spending was about $750 billion. Maintaining such an enormously expensive military results in underinvestment in urgent domestic needs like job creation, universal pre-K, and free community college, and mitigating the climate catastrophe. We should move toward a peace economy in which we substantially reduce military spending so that it is robustly adequate for the defense of the US, but no longer budgets for the US to be constantly ready to intervene militarily in trouble spots around the world. By the way, you all probably know there are 850 US bases outside of the United States. And China, just for a quick comparison, has 2. An additional very large area of savings is the hugely expensive US nuclear modernization program, projected to cost $2 trillion over the next 30 years. We should instead negotiate verifiable nuclear reduction treaties, including eliminating land-based nuclear weapons, which are alarmingly prone to being launched accidentally during a crisis. Ambassador Graham referenced that problem earlier. If we reallocate a substantial portion of the savings from reducing US military spending towards strengthening diplomacy, one of our campaigns, you may know, is Diplomacy Not War, strengthening diplomacy and public health, humanitarian and development assistance to global trouble spots, we would increase security and well-being for ourselves and others. This would bring us much closer to the age-old vision of peace on earth. So I think by doing that, I have finished at about the projected time. Hallelujah. It's a good way to discipline a long-winded preacher. And I think we are ready to start the Q&A period, Ed. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct, yes. And we have the first question will be for Ambassador Tom Graham. And by the way, folks, you can keep putting your questions in to the chat room, send it in to me, and we will keep forwarding them. So the first question, Ambassador Graham, President Obama wanted to have a no first use policy, but he met great opposition. You mentioned that briefly. What were the forces that were arrayed against it, and have they been weakened so that we may realistically pass it now? Ambassador Graham.
Well, that's a very good question. The forces, of course, that were arrayed against President Obama were the military and their congressional allies, because no first use, or first use, I should say, was always the basis for the nuclear umbrella arrangements that we made with our allies around the world, over NATO, over Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and one or two other countries. And the military view then, and had been since 1950 or so, or 60 anyway, that these arrangements have kept the peace. They've also kept those countries from going nuclear themselves. If we were ever to go to no first use, Japan and Korea would instantly build nuclear weapon programs. I heard that from a Japanese myself once, but I'm not sure that's accurate anymore. I think what's changed is that it's less likely that if nuclear umbrella arrangements are gradually dismantled, that the countries being protected would want to build nuclear weapon forces themselves. There'll still be a NATO. There'll still be close alliances with Japan and Germany and South Korea and so forth, but they no longer feel or believe that they need the protection of nuclear weapons because there's no more Soviet Union, and they don't think that Russia and China, as aggressive as they may be, are really after World War in the classic sense, rather World War with economic means. So the playing field has changed, and that's why there's a chance that President Biden can do that. When I tried to do it in the mid-'80s, I had the backing of our ambassador to China and the senior disarmament officer. We sent a joint cable from Beijing, and you would have thought we set off a tactical nuclear weapon in Washington. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs personally called up the relevant officer in the White House and demanded that our cable be scrubbed from the record, and the three ambassadors. And so it was a very toxic situation for a very long time. Obama, it was still there when Obama tried to do it, but it seems to be substantially dissipated now.
And just, I guess, a quick follow-up. You had, I believe you mentioned that China currently does have a no first use policy. Is that correct? So would that help in terms of persuasion of the president and others to put that in the NPR?
No, I don't think so, because they've had it since 1955, and either it's kept them from building large nuclear forces, and maybe it has, because the Chinese have never thought they had to have a big nuclear arsenal. Mao famously said, nuclear weapons are paper tigers. And that's what they believe. And also there's a lot of people don't believe the Chinese, whereas I think they can be believed, but that's unknowable. But so anyway, I don't think it would have a prominent effect, but what's changed is the international atmosphere, and also the domestic situation here, where the military and many of us realize that the other crises we face are so great that this was not one that we need to invest a lot of political capital.
Okay, thank you. We have a question, And by the way, that question was from Jeffrey Laurenti, the president of the Princeton chapter of UNA, UN Association. For Erin Hunt, we have a question, and they ask, can you tell us a little bit about the situation in Scotland? Is there a chance that Scotland may be able to veto nuclear, the Trident nuclear subs in Scottish ports?
Oh, Scotland, much to my grandmother's dismay, I'm sure, is not an area of my expertise. Pretty sure grandma's rolling over in her grave right now. My basic understanding of the situation is that the devolved government, the Scottish government, is a strong supporter of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and that should Scotland become an independent state, the British nuclear weapons would have to find a new home. Odds of that going on right now, I'd probably refer you to Scottish campaigners. There are some really excellent work being done by Icann campaigners in Scotland, focusing on the city appeal as well as disinvestment, and they're making really great progress there. So I think there's a lot of strong support within Scotland for a change. But I don't believe at the moment the Scottish government has the power to force the subs out of the base based on the current power structure.
So it's a little more complicated because Scotland would really need to be sovereign and as an independent state to actually accomplish it. But we do know that the Scottish people seem to be very much in favor of the treaty and getting rid of nuclear weapons.
And could I just briefly mention that as a largely Scottish ethnic background, I'm with the Scots. And there's a lot of support for Scotland in this country, being its own entity.
Right. Okay.
So sorry,
next,
just to add, I can say
go
that
ahead.
if there's another referendum and Scotland does become an independent sovereign nation, based on the last white paper on that, as a magically Scottish citizen, I would become, I would be voting for the new government to join the treaty. So
we have Scotland everywhere here.
Armament minister.
Oh no, there's enough people who live in Scotland that could fill that role. I'll just happily exercise my franchise in the new country.
All right. We have a question from Larry Holman for Bob Moore. And you kind of covered it, but you may want to elaborate. Our defense budget is $7 trillion in the next 10 years, a huge amount. Can you elaborate on how this much money could be used instead for the things we really need?
Yes, and thank you, Larry. And by the way, that's probably an underestimate. Bill Hartung, who I think is the top expert really on total U.S. military spending, which includes things like a portion of the national debt, because a lot of our spending, especially on these endless wars, was done through borrowed money. So an estimated 2/3 of our national debt is war incurred from wars. So it's probably closer to $1 trillion a year, which makes it 10 trillion. And speaking of $10 trillion, that is precisely the number that I've been seeing for what would really need to be spent to get a handle on the climate catastrophe. You know, we've got a $1 trillion bipartisan bill that's waiting in Congress, and I'm glad for that at least there's a starting point there. But it's very, very small compared to what needs to happen. We need to be on such a really fast and determined track. Experts are telling us we need to reduce greenhouse gases by at least 50% by 2030, 9 years from now. and then get all the way to zero emissions, net zero by 2050, to have a chance of getting a handle on this. So there's just so many things that have been unaddressed in the United States. Class inequalities, the huge wealth gap. I mean, this is something, if I just take a minute, it's utterly huge. So in the United States writ large, the average wealth gap between white families and African-American families is 13-1. Here in New Jersey, because a large part of the wealth of families is often the home that they own, it's 50-1. The average white family has 50 times the wealth of the average African-American family. So there's just huge inequalities. We're seeing it in the much increased rate